1 year ago, one country in Europe put a far-right party in power, Italy. But it's not just there. Far-right parties are gaining ground in many European countries. That's why so many eyes are on Italy right now. What happens when a far-right leader is in power in Europe? In this video, we're taking a look at one of Europe's most divisive figures, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni.
Did her 3 biggest election promises become reality?
Critics said she would wreak havoc in the EU. But did that actually happen? Let's start with what Italians think of their leader 1 year in.
I realized that it wasn't that bad as it seems at the first.
Ho votato per Meloni, mi aspettavo molto di più, che facesse molto di più per il paese.
Sono molto arrabbiata per quello che sta succedendo in Italia e penso che stiamo attraversando forse uno dei periodi peggiori politicamente di questo paese.
All the promise that she made during the elections was bullshit. She talked a lot about migrants, people coming from Africa. For her was the biggest problem.
It's not surprising people judge her on migration. It was a massive topic during her campaign. So let's start with election promise number 1. Essentially, Meloni promised to stop irregular arrivals of migrants on Italy's shores. The context on this, Italy has the highest numbers of migrant arrivals of any EU member state, by a huge margin. That's because the most common way of reaching Europe for asylum seekers is crossing the sea from North Africa or Turkey by boat. The journey is very dangerous, so many aim for the tiny Italian island of Lampedusa, located between Tunisia and mainland Italy. Meloni had promised to put a stop to this. One of her suggestions? Blocking boats from leaving North Africa, even though critics say a naval blockade violates human rights. She hasn't managed to do it, and the number of migrant arrivals is actually increasing. We talked to Davide Vampa, an Italian political scientist in the UK, to find out why this is. He told us it's not a surprise that Meloni has failed to keep her promise.
The issue of migration is a classic example of electoral slogans, electoral promises that then are not implemented once you are in power, because reality is much more complex.
Meloni is stuck between a rock and a hard place because she can't meet her promise of cutting immigration alone. She needs help from the EU.
On the one hand, she is allied with leaders like Viktor Orban or the Polish government and so on. But at the same time, these governments are blocking any kind of European cooperation on immigration.
So it's kind of ironic that Meloni's Eurosceptic allies are the ones standing in her way of meeting her promises on cutting migration. This takes us on to election promise 2, relations with the EU. Meloni used to want Italy to leave the EU and stop using the euro. Even though she had stopped saying that by last year's campaign, she still has a lot of contempt for the bloc. In her manifesto, she calls the use of European funds a joke and calls for a Europe of homelands. This is why it's not just in Italy that Meloni's election triggered fears and concerns, but also across Europe. Italy is one of the EU's founding members and has one of its biggest populations and its 3rd biggest economy. Never before has such a big, powerful and financially important country in the EU had such a Eurosceptic leader. There were fears across Europe that Meloni could totally destabilise the EU, but she hasn't. So what is going on?
There's simply no way Italy can survive politically and economically outside of Europe.
That's Cecilia Sottilotta, a political scientist at a university in Perugia in Italy. She said the Italian government's hands would always be tied.
And she knew that very well. So she had to soften her rhetoric, but also her intentions towards Europe. We should not forget that Italy needs Europe as much as Europe needs Italy.
Basically, Italy needs the cash. That's why many researchers and pundits are saying Meloni is playing a double game. Extreme at home, moderate on the European stage.
One of the points that I think she keeps repeating is we are working to push for Italian interests. We want to have Italy's voice heard at the European table.
One example for that is the European Common Asylum System. While still cooperating with other EU leaders, Meloni's government wants to make it as hard as possible to gain asylum in Europe. So in terms of her policy, Meloni is not really more moderate at the EU level. She still wants hard right measures in place. Let's turn to the 3rd of her promises, her focus on traditional family values. For her, a family consists of a mother, father and children, meaning same-sex couples are excluded. That's why LGBT activists in the whole of Europe sounded the alarm. As many expected, she is now cutting rights for LGBT couples. At the same time, Meloni promised to increase child payments in an attempt to boost Italy's birth rate. And she did increase the payments, but at the same time, she scrapped welfare benefits for poor families and told them about it by text message. Still, some say Meloni isn't as dangerous as she was made out to be. We asked political scientist George Newth this question.
The commentators are making these assertions that she is less dangerous and less damaging, that now she's in power, probably need to kind of reflect on where they're coming from. I think if you are a marginalized group in Italy, or, you know, in general, a person of color, or if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, then she's a very dangerous person indeed.
So that was year one of the Meloni mandate. There is a kind of double game going on, playing nice with the EU while showing her hard right roots at home, but ultimately she wants to use the EU to do the same thing she wants to do in Italy, stop migration. So it's all part of one strategy. So what do people in Italy think of her now?
Non c'è nessun tipo di lungimiranza verso i giovani, la sostenibilità, è una tragedia come da tutti i punti di vista, veramente.
She didn't realize actually what I was hoping for this country.
Facciamola lavorare con calma, serve ancora un po' di tempo per poter fare tutto quello che sta nel suo registro. Sicuramente rivoterò la Meloni.
I'm really close to the LGBTQ community, so from a social point of view, I felt like things changed in a worse way. That's not like a country should be.
And what is next for Meloni? At the moment, she remains popular in Italy, polling way ahead of her opponents. And EU leaders abroad seem reassured she is not going to try to destroy Europe from within. But George told us the honeymoon phase is over.
They're not able to make the structural reforms that they promised in terms of the economy. So winter is coming, let's say, for Meloni's government.
How popular are far-right politicians in your country? Tell us about it in the comments.